Hey everybody, in this lecture we're going to start talking about our third unit, and we're going to move into the 19th century and start talking about the Victorians and their world. So let's start with a bit of an overview. We're going to be reading Karen Haltunen's Confidence Men and Painted Women. A good book, challenging book, but that's what we do in college. We read some challenging books sometimes. Going to learn a lot from this book. Let's talk about the Victorian era, okay? As far as my class is concerned, we're going to characterize the Victorian era as the period from 1830 to 1900, so that 70-year period of the 19th century. It's called the Victorian era because it's named after Queen Victoria of Great Britain. She ruled England from 1837 to right around 1900, and English culture and frankly a lot of former British colonies like the United States refer to this period of the 19th century as the Victorian era. It shows some of the indebtedness that, even despite the United States being its own country for a long time, was still sort of deeply influenced by English ideas and cultural notions. Okay, excuse me, the Victorians were the middle class white Americans, and that's who we're referred to. When we talk about the Victorians, we're not talking about the rich. We're not talking about the poor and working class. The Victorians were considered the sort of solid, stable middle of American culture at the time, society of the time. By the way, I'm not necessarily saying they absolutely were stable or moral, but that's how they perceived themselves. As we'll talk about, the rich could be decadent and corrupt. The poor were often interpreted as lazy and stupid and inclined toward criminality, but it was the middle class that viewed themselves as the backbone of American society. Okay. What we're going to be talking about this lecture and probably the next one are dramatic changes that were happening in the 19th century. And Victorianism, the ism of Victorianism, their system of beliefs, their ideas, were very much responding to this dramatic change that was going on. Before we can talk about Victorianism, their beliefs and their ideas, we need to talk, excuse me, we need to talk about these really dramatic changes. All right, and we're going to spend a lot of time discussing this. I like to compare the 20th century and the 19th century when it comes to this idea of change. The 20th century had dramatic change, shocking levels of change. However, by the time we get to the 20th century, Americans are expecting change. They are prepared for change. They have been socialized to expect change coming. That doesn't mean change was always easy for 20th century Americans, but they knew it was coming. What was so dramatic about the changes in the 19th century was the relative unpreparedness for this change. And this is what made the change that much more shocking. Whenever I teach this class and I talk about this subject, and by the way, I talk about change in the 19th century in lots of different classes I teach. I always make a silly analogy to standing in the classroom and scaring students as they walk in. All right? If I stood by the doorway hidden, and then as a student walked in, popped out and yelled at that student, they would be shocked and terrified. But if that student went out the other door and then warned every student that was coming in, hey, professor's gone crazy. He's just yelling at people when they walk into the classroom. The following students that would be coming in would not be surprised because they were expecting me to yell. This is kind of the difference between the 19th century and the 20th century. Okay, 20th century Americans were expecting change, so they weren't as surprised by it. But the 19th century was that student walking into that classroom that had not been warned, I'm going to yell at them when they walk in. And they were shocked by it. And so Victorianism is going to be kind of like a coping mechanism for very dramatic change that was going on in the 19th century. It was a way of them making sense of this change and trying to use various values and beliefs to help them cope with it, to deal with it. Okay. One very simplistic way of thinking about this is you can almost go back to our old friends, the Puritans, and their very simplistic way of life, and at least for the people of Denham, and their subsistence farming and their small towns. And then us today with our modern, urban, capitalist lifestyle. We can almost think of the Victorians as the transition between these worlds. That things that the Victorians had to grapple with and had to get used to made it possible for us to live in this world that we live in today. Again, that's very simplistic. It's way more complex than that. But to try and understand this history, it kind of works. It kind of works. So I will continue making reference both to the Puritans and Franklin as we go on in this unit. All right, here's a list of these changes that we're going to be talking about, okay? Industrialism, capitalism, changes in transportation, social mobility, I'll explain what I mean by that, urbanization, immigration, and changes in politics, okay? These are all going to be interrelated, that changes in one of these areas was influencing changes in practically all of these other areas. It was dealing with these changes that is going to encourage the Victorians to believe in certain things and trust in certain things. So what I'm going to do now is start talking about these transformations that were happening in the 19th century. By the way, some of these were trends that were starting maybe a little bit before the 19th century or starting a little bit deeper into there. But what's important is by the time we get to the Victorian era, by the time we get to the 1830s, these things are all starting to accelerate and become more dominant issues that people felt like they needed to grapple with. All right. So let's start with the first, industrialism. Again, go back to our Puritan friends, okay? Very simple way of life, very simple economy, mostly subsistent farming in a place like Denham. People that weren't farmers were often doing something engaged in helping farmers, like we talked about before. Very little cash being exchanged in any sort of regular basis. Most economic exchange in Denham was trading. This neighbor has a surplus of this crop, trades it to another farmer that has another surplus of a different crop. Very simple economy. Remember when Benjamin Franklin needed a printing press. I told you, colonial North America, even into the 1700s, at least the early 1700s, when we're talking about with Franklin, didn't make printing presses. They didn't have that sort of manufacturing and engineering infrastructure set up to do things. So they had to go back to England. Franklin did to first try to buy it, and we talked about how that effort failed, but then later on just sending correspondence to get it. By the time we're getting into the 1800s, America is starting to industrialize. Okay, still going to be a lot of farmers. Still, most people through the early and middle 1800s are still farmers. But we're starting to get industrialism. The first industry that was going to use manufacturing was going to be the textile industry, the making of cloth. The Americans produced a lot of cotton and shipped a lot of that cotton to England. And England would refine that, turn it into material, and ship some of it back, first to the colonies and then later to the United States. By the very end of the 1700s and very much accelerating in the 1800s, there was a growing number of American entrepreneurs who decided, well, why don't we build textile factories? And you needed to use hydropower, water power. You put your factory near a strong river, put a paddle wheel in there that would power giant looms that would operate these machines that would take something like raw cotton and turn it into textile. Okay. Other industries would grow as time would go on here with industrialism. And what's important about this industrialism also is that it spurred a lot of other things. Okay. Advances in banking and insurance services. Okay, it was expensive to build a factory. Maybe one person didn't have enough money to do so, so you got loans from banks. You needed ways to insure your business. You're probably not going to build a giant factory if there's the possibility there's going to be a fire that is going to destroy it, and then you're going to be out all that money. Transportation, we'll talk more about transportation, but transportation networks had to increase in terms of their utility for the nation, because what good does it do you to be able to produce 10,000 bolts of cotton fabric if you can't move them effectively, more than 3 miles away from your factory? So transportation networks, new innovations in business strategy, complex understandings of corporate structure, again, to raise partners, to defray the possibility of losses. Industrialism is going to spur a lot of other advances. We're going to talk a lot about industrialism as we go. Okay. Number 2 on our list, the growth of capitalism. Again, economic exchange back in Denham was rather not only simple, but communal. Okay, the Puritans did not think of themselves in competition with one another. Okay, just the opposite. They thought of themselves as almost in an organic sense, like the community was like a living organism where every person played a part, like every part of a body has a purpose and a function. Now, they believed in hierarchy, and some were more important and some were less important. Some people were the heart, vital to the existence of the community. Some people were the baby toe. You need your baby toe, but you're not going to die if you don't have it. But nonetheless, everybody has a part and a purpose, and they didn't really think of themselves in competition with one another. But coming along with industrialism and spurring industrialism was the rise of capitalism. Capitalism is this very individualistic and competitive economic system where people find themselves being in competition with one another and interested in maximizing their own self-interest. Okay, very competitive, very individualistic. Now, the promise of this competition and this individualism is that it's a productive economy that creates lots of goods and services at lower prices because of this competition. So the promise of capitalism is, despite this competition, the broader society is served by more affordable products, better quality products as a result of this competition. But this capitalism is going to be something of a change in mentality. With all of these changes I'm going to talk about, there were good things about them that some people were excited about and anxious and looking forward to. And with all of them, there were problems and things to be worried and concerned about, and people that were hurt by these transformations, right? These were complex transformations. Some people benefited, some people were hurt by them. Some people were excited and optimistic about them. Some people were fearful and terrified of these changes. This is why Victorianism is going to be this coping mechanism. With capitalism, some people were going to be disturbed by this individualistic, competitive nature. What's going to happen to a society in the long run if everybody just seems to be out for themselves? If everybody views themselves as being in competition with everybody else? Isn't there some potential corrosive effect on society in the long run? This was something that some people worried about when it came to Victorianism. Okay, however, it was a dynamic form of economics. It spurred tremendous growth in the 1800s. Tremendous growth. All right, so this is again going to be one of the changes that we're going to talk about the Victorians having to deal with and cope with. And already you can see how this growing industrialism was spurred on by growing capitalism and vice versa, that these things were interconnected. Okay. Let's talk about transportation. Dramatic changes in advances in transportation as we start getting into the 1800s. Like I talked about before when I talked about the growth of industrialism, it doesn't do a lot of good building a bunch of factories if you cannot get the products from those factories into the hands of consumers. You need to be able to move these products. At first, in terms of regional areas, and then eventually across entire national networks, across entire continents, or the continent, as we're talking about here in American history. Now, early in the 1800s, going back even into the 1700s, one of the efforts was in terms of canal building. A canal connects one waterway to another waterway. Remember when we were talking about Benjamin Franklin, and I pointed out in one of the lectures, hey, you notice how Ben's always going everywhere on boat instead of just getting on a horse and riding between, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia? He'd get on a boat. It was easier to move things, somewhat quicker, somewhat safer, at least on waterways, to move things by boat. And this is particularly true when it comes to shipping products and goods. Water's heavy. It takes a lot to displace water. So you can really put a lot of stuff on a sturdy boat and, easily float it places. Roads were bad back then. Wagons were bad back then. It was hard to ship things over land in the beginning. As we'll talk about, the railroad's going to solve that problem. So the late 1700s and into the early 1800s, there was this big push for canal building. Canal building is advanced engineering. Okay, it might sound easy. Oh, I just dig a trench between this river and that river. But the problem is if you don't do that right, it's going to drain all the water out of one river and it's going to go into the other river and it's going to flood everything. So it's advanced engineering to get just the right amount of water from one place to another. But then you could connect various waterways and ship things. Right? By the time we start getting to the 1830s, right at the beginning of this Victorian era that we're discussing, excuse me, that we are discussing, we start getting railroads. And railroads are going to be a game changer. You are going to be able to move not only people on trains, but also goods and products. Okay, you're not going to need riverways anymore. So it dramatically changes where products can go to. Okay. But it wasn't just railroads as a transportation source that's going to be really important. Railroads are also going to be really important in terms of creating new business models and new understandings of corporate structure. Okay. Railroads were very expensive to build. Right? You needed to acquire a lot of land. The railroad engine and cars and things along those lines were advanced engineering for the time. Everything about railroads and building was expensive in the beginning. And the United States was different from most other countries. In most other countries, the government built the railroads. They built them and owned them, sort of like a public utility. The United States was different, though. The United States did this mostly through private investment. This was a private sector thing. And because it cost so much money to build these things, Americans developed new, very complex ways of raising money to build these. This would be very helpful because once you figured out how to raise money to own a railroad, you could figure out ways to raise money in the same sort of ways for lots of different industries in this growing industrial world. The sort of business know-how that it came to raising money would be applied to other industries in the 1800s. Also, running a railroad was extremely complex. Okay, we're talking about something that crossed state lines, that needed to be managed over great distances. It required new types of business organization, corporate structure to make all this run efficiently. And once again, this new know-how in terms of corporate structure and how to manage a very complex business over a large area of land was going to be applied to other industries. The railroad as a business model would become the model of a lot of corporate structure and financial structure for the 1800s. Right? So there's when we talk about the importance of transportation, one, we talk about it in the most straightforward way, like it was important and necessary for the growth of the economy. But it was also sort of this laboratory for experimenting in finance and corporate structure that was going to be applied to a lot of other industries going forward. Let's talk about one more of these in this lecture. Let's talk about social mobility. When we were talking about the Puritans, and one of the points Lockridge made about Denham was that Denham was a very stable community. It was static, as he discussed, and I told you about. I like that, using his language of static. It just, once the town was set up, there was this disinclination towards dramatic change. And after the earliest settlers came, there weren't a lot of people leaving, there weren't a lot of people coming to Denham. It remained rather static. By the time we get to the 1800s, particularly this Victorian era in the 1830s and afterwards, and this would accelerate throughout the 1800s, there are more and more Americans moving around, leaving the place where they grew up and going to somewhere new. Okay. I think I told you in one of the Franklin lectures. If I didn't, well, okay, I'm telling you now. One of the reasons so many people read Benjamin Franklin's autobiography during this Victorian era that we're talking about was that in the way Franklin described his life seemed very familiar to a lot of Victorians. Right? He was urban. He grew up in a big city. Boston was a big city for the Americans. He was not employed in farming. Okay, that seems familiar to the 1800s increasingly. He moved around. He left his hometown of Boston to find better opportunity in Philadelphia. Franklin's life story was very unusual for the early 1700s. The people of Denham would have been a lot more typical. That was much more normal. Benjamin Franklin was very unusual in the circumstances of his life. But once you start getting into the 1800s, and particularly the Victorian era, suddenly Franklin's, life seems more familiar. And so people read it partly. I told you, Franklin himself thought of it as an advice manual, but it was a more useful advice manual for the 19th century. Okay? People are moving around a lot more as we get into the 1800s. Okay? Look at this. Look at these maps I have for you here. From the first map on the left is from the year 1800. That's what the United States looked like. It looks fairly similar to what the nation looked like in 1776 when it began. Mostly a collection of the early colonies turned into states for the new nation. By the time we get to 1800, there are a couple more states popping out, starting to push out towards the west. But seems kind of familiar to the very beginning of the Republic. Okay. Look at a map of the United States for the year 100 years later in 1900. That's the map on the right. It looks very familiar to the present look of the United States. Almost all the states are there, and the only ones that aren't there, that are going to be there pretty soon, they even look like the shape that they're going to take on. You have Arizona, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, the territory at the time. All of this is happening in the 1900s, this westward movement. Also, a lot of north-south movement. When we tend to talk about American history, we tend to think of it in terms of westward movement. But there was also a lot of north-south, particularly the southern colonies, the Virginia, the Carolinas. People are going to burn out their land growing tobacco and things like that and look for more fertile land, and are going to increasingly start moving towards southern states that you get. So a lot of that sort of movement going on. Also, a lot of movement towards urban areas that are going to be going on. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail. But a lot of movement. Okay. And again, Americans were feeling, some Americans were excited and anxious about this ability to move to new places, to leave a community that they don't want to be in and go and find a new sense of community. Others were troubled by this. It gave this sense of life as being rootless, of a nation of vagabonds just traipsing from one place to another. There was a sense of rootlessness. That's the way some people interpreted what was going on. When we talk about all of these changes, one way to potentially think about them is that Americans in the 19th century were anxious. Okay. Anxiety is a mixture of emotions. To be anxious is a mixture of emotions. Some people use, anxiety and sadness and think of them as the same thing. They're not the same thing. To be anxious is a mixture of emotions. On the one hand, you're worried and concerned because whatever the thing you're pondering could turn out badly. On the other hand, you're also excited because whatever this thing that you're pondering could turn out really well. So if you go on a first date, before this first date, you are anxious. You feel anxiety because on the one hand, hey, maybe this is going to be a great date. Maybe I'm going to really like this person. Maybe this person's going to be the one. Or maybe it's going to go really horrible. Maybe I'm not going to like this person. Maybe this person isn't going to like me. Maybe I'm about to spend time with my next stalker. Maybe it's going to go horrible. Okay? You don't know at a time. You're feeling anxious. There were a lot of Americans that felt anxious in the 19th century, right? Particularly about these changes. There were some good aspects to these changes, and there were some worrisome aspects to these changes. So, social mobility, this increasing movement, caused some people to be excited and caused other people to worry. Think of how problematic this would have seemed to our old our old Puritan friends. They would find it difficult to imagine people would want to live in a world like this where everybody's just moving around. Okay, everybody, that's a good place to stop for this lecture. We'll pick up on the rest of the list with these changes in our next lecture. All right, take care. Bye.